specified more and more and more precisely, such that education is a means to that end of hitting those targets. Without those targets being subjected to that ethical discussion, how are they enabling these young people to be, as it were, more human in terms of awareness, in terms of practical capability, in terms of moral seriousness and so on? How is it doing that? And so we've now got a language of targets, of performance indicators, of audits, of inputs versus outputs, of league tables, of failing schools that don't hit those targets. And some of my work was spent in a brilliant school, one of the most inspiring schools I've ever been in. There was real leadership, but declared by the Secretary of State for Education as a failing school. What it was doing, this most difficult part of Tower Hamlets, was engaging these young people. Hear this student's voice saying this school really is committed to these values of fairness, justice, and so on. Remarkable achievement with some of the most difficult kids, most difficult areas. But it hadn't hit these targets. But it was, to my mind, one of the most inspiring education. There was Oakeshott working in reality. So that's what I want to see. There's a division between that ethical dimension to education, which is really absolutely intrinsic to really good educational leadership, and indeed the management speak, the notion of effectiveness, which is defined increasingly outside any sort of ethical context. And I think where one sees this in particular is in the notion of what we mean by teaching. So that's my second point now, is coming on to the notion of teaching. Because in that management speak that permeates so much of the documents, the thinking in education, we're constantly seeing, I've heard in conference after conference where government speakers and civil servants, as they talk about the teacher delivering the curriculum. The curriculum, it's something that's been handed on from QCA, now QCD, now has been finally buried. They hand on the curriculum. The teacher is essentially the one who delivers that to the young people. And I think increasingly now we have a generation of teachers that during their training, etc., have not known any other kind of language about education or about the goals set in terms of these particular kind of things. And what I want to say, go back to that different metaphor again, back to that ethical dimension, that what one is seeing is the teacher is essentially there at the very center of these youngsters' lives, mediating, and this is where Dewey had it right, mediating that which we have inherited in terms of the best, well, Matthew Arnold, the best that's been thought and said, or in terms of craft and so on, engineering, the best that we've achieved in making and constructing and creating the arts, mediating that on the one hand to the lives, the modes of understanding and the conditions of the young children on the other. That is a different view of what it is to be a teacher than it is delivering a curriculum. It puts the teachers, once again, at the actual center, not as curriculum deliverers, but as curriculum creators, as curriculum makers, obviously within a framework. And of course now one harks back to a time when I first joined the Ministry of Education as a young civil servant in 1962. I was joined a thing called the Curriculum Study Group, the ministry then in Curzon Street. And the Curriculum Study Group had been set up because the government said, well, we need to have something to do with it. Don't forget, before 1988, before 1977, 6, and so on, the government had nothing to say about the content of education or the mode of teaching in this country. It was in 1977, 6, Ruskin speech with Callaghan was the first Prime Minister ever in this country to have given a major speech on education. And his political advisor who wrote the speech was summoned by the Chief Inspector for Schools. She Sheila Brown. Diminutively late, still see her around on holiday. Only around that high. Strong woman. Who called Donahue in and told him of, and told the Prime Minister of, for daring to say anything about education without her approval and her agreement. It was not the job of the government to tell teachers what to teach and how to do. Teachers reflecting a tradition of what counts as worthwhile learning. Now, there were lots of things wrong. Can't go back there. Can't go back there. But at least there was a view of teaching as at the very centre. And therefore, leadership is now enabling teachers to carry out that function of being the mediators of what is good, what we've inherited, that makes sense to these young people. And when I started teaching in the late 60s and into the 70s in Camden Town, London, we had these teacher centres. We set up the curriculum study group, set up the schools council, which itself was an example of democracy, in which the teacher's voice was crucial in thinking through science. Think of Nuffield Sciences. Think of the Humanities Curriculum Project coming out of the University of East Anglia. Think of geography for the young school leader. There was real thinking there, and at the centre of that was the teaching profession. We had teacher centres all over, so I was teaching in this particular school, and we worked cooperatively with teachers from other schools in the teacher centre in Highgate, Highbury as it was then, in which teachers were themselves learners, but learners they brought to this, to the educational scene, their experience, their knowledge, their reflection, and that was how the curriculum was being developed. So I want to say that about teaching. And leadership must be enabling. And we used to run these courses in Oxford. I got the money from the Sutton Trust, and we ran courses, and I used to help run these, organising them and so on. About 120 teachers a year, all expenses paid, spent a week in Oxford. And the first, they were very surprised, because they were expecting a whole lot of lectures to be given. And there was not. They had access to the Bodleian Library, they had access to tutors in the history department, they were able to work in the physics department alongside the visitors and so on. And one teacher came to me and said, he's a man in his mid-40s. He said, you know, this is the first time in my teaching career I have felt respect. First time. Why? Because he had a week in which he was able to set his program in terms of his learning needs, in terms of what he needed when he went back to school. And it was a highly successful course. So the teachers, therefore, as learners within this. Finally, then, I want to say something about the provision of education. One of the strong things we put in our review is if you're going to start with the learners, what is the kind of organisation of schools we have? Unfortunately, because we have been, as it were, mesmerised by a particular management in terms of targets, league tables, competition and one thing another, it does seem that so often schools are putting the institution before the learner. If we're going to start with the learner, what we have argued very strongly in our report is no one school can go to learn. No one college can go to learn. There's now about 120,000 young people aged 14 to 16 who have a substantial part of their curriculum learning, their curriculum in colleges of further education. Because the colleges of further education have the capacity and the resources in order to engage much more practical work. They have the restaurants, the catering, they have the carpentry, they have a whole range of things which enables young people who are going to learn much more effectively through practical engagement to be able to do that. I had a meeting the other day with Kenneth Baker, who used to be Secretary of State at the time, and of course he is now setting up these university technology colleges, 14 to 19, where there's a great focus upon that practical making and doing, leading to engineering and so on, which he feels has been so neglected in our schools. So what we say in our report is no one school, but therefore one